a quick round of introduction, and then we're going to get started. Iman.
Hi, my name is Iman. I am internationally trained and practicing architect and architectural designer, educator, and researcher as well, with a special focus on urbanization, affordable housing issues from a gender perspective.
Great. Lydia?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lydia Stasem. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Global Homelessness. We're headquartered in Chicago, but we work on issues of homelessness and housing insecurity around the world. It's a pleasure to be with you all today.
Yeah, welcome. Satish Kumar? Or Candace?
So some of the speakers are not present.
Yeah. Anne?
Anne is a volunteer.
Oh, Anne is volunteer. Okay, why don't we get started? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So this session is about financial elements and practical challenges in planning, creating, and implementing walkable neighborhoods. My name is Yvonne Young. I'm the CEO of SDG Strategies. It's a strategy consulting firm based in Canada. And what we're going to talk about today is primarily focusing on implementation and trying to understand what are some of the creative financing we can utilize when we're implementing walkable neighborhood. So we're going to start off with 5-minute presentation to setting the stage, zooming out from the regional scale all the way to the development scale. Primarily what we want to understand is each piece of infrastructure that is needed in order for implementation, and thinking about, as we are making financial decisions, how we can optimize those infrastructure to provide for inclusive outcome. Then we're going to have approximately 5 to 7 minutes of presentation. And if you have slides that you would like to use, you can simply do a share screen. And then what we like to do is to allocate some time for a meaningful discussion at the end. We'll be drafting a few bullets together that contribute to the resolution as part of this forum to present as part of the G7. So what we want to start off looking at is the opportunity in front of us is unprecedented. We are looking at the fastest city region in North America, and primarily why this is significant is because this is also the second largest financial center. What we're seeing on the ground that is happening is there are $62 billion of transit infrastructure already invested. Also, at the same time, they would unlock 45,000 acres of developable land. Now, the challenge is that how you can turn the image from the left to the image to the right. So in our current world, a majority of the area is actually in auto-dependent suburb, where 3 over 4 of the children, they do not walk or bike to school. So this is fundamental, is shaping the way how families and also majority of the population is living from a day-to-day basis. So our challenge is to tackle climate change. And in delivering walkable neighborhood, what we want to do a deep dive is that how we can look at creative financing and prioritization so we can make the shift from auto dependency to active transportation, which address 2/3 of the problem. Another half of the problem is dealing with built form. So looking at green building and also how we can shape the physical environment so it can provide for equal access to daylight and flow. In Canada, 95% of our economy is based on small businesses. In the United States, I think the number is a little bit even higher than that. So that means as we are creating walkable neighborhood, what is instrumental is finding a way to grow the local economy. So these are the sets of cornerstones of infrastructure that we need to use to unlock developments from hard infrastructure that include water, wastewater, and storm sewer, to soft infrastructure from daycare, school, health, social, and parks, active mobility from transit, walking, cycling, and micromobility, and economic infrastructure, so which is broadband. So as we learn from over the last 2 to 3 years, the importance of having the virtual connection to provide for equitable access to not just the local community, but to the global world is paramount. Another element is cultural infrastructure. So this is instrumental in terms of building the food, the culinary, the urban agriculture, and also finding a creative way that we can work with the developer who are developing those products to creatively incorporate the knowledge-based economy. And lastly is climate infrastructure. So that's dealing with environmental, trees, clean energy, and green building. What we fundamentally find is the issue is that there are various different jurisdiction boundary, and also there's very different standards when it comes to how we regulate these environmental issues. So we're going to do a deep dive. So present to you in here is an example, so we can focus our conversation on something that is tangible. This is potentially looking at an example, looking at the overall city scale. What if there's opportunity to create a predictable land capacity? Primarily is aligning the orange, so which are land that is developable directly along transit line, so which is the yellow line. And the second step is finding a way to optimize public assets in infrastructure finance decision. So that means everybody will need to step out of their comfort zone a little bit and wear a different hat. Looking at how we can optimize the stations and also the school sites, focusing on using the site as the beginning of a hub, so we can provide for the walkable access to daily needs. And then is how you can connect all the public assets to amplify community outcome. So this is interesting in a way that a lot of the city across the world, there are abundant resource for existing parks and open spaces, but they are not connected. So this is looking at opportunity, how can potentially connecting the developable sites, so which is what is shown in orange in here, the white dot, so which is the transit station, and also providing connection to the school sites. So those are the blue dots. And what is fundamentally here is that really looking at creative financing, so we can focusing on making the resource possible. So a city and a regional scale can implement the active mobility at scale. And then lastly is a framework to allocate financial resourcing. So Helsinki made the shift in 1970s. The first thing that they did is that they studied the overall city structure and divide the overall decision boundaries based on walkable distance. So this is a test looking at the city that we are currently in. And what if we apply the same model, how we can also break up the decision boundaries so that it's primarily focusing on providing resource allocated at walkable distance. So this is a little bit tangible of what it means if we zoom in on one of those neighborhoods. So this is very typical in North American setting. In fact, 80% of the area within our world is in this transition stage. So we have a development that is single users with parking lots, but also there are existing facilities and land that we're seeing a large-scale development coming in. So this is primarily thinking about when we are financing and also prioritizing infrastructure, how we can prioritize those to unlock the whole neighborhood at scale. So this is a test looking at what if there's an opportunity to create a template potentially applied to different cities across North America, starting with 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, primarily looking at providing comprehensive list of infrastructure from social, climate, active mobility, culture, economic, and hard infrastructure. And then lastly is finding a way to provide incentive for developer so that as we are looking at developments coming to the city region, looking at those parking lot transform is not one piece at a time, but also the critical piece of the walking and cycling and streetscape, those can come in first. So we can use that to shift the behavior. So now I'm going to turn to our speaker, and you have around 5 to 7 minutes to share your thoughts, and feel free to use your screen. And welcome, Matthew. All right, so let's turn to Dr. Iwinda. You're on mute.
Me? I am
Yeah.
the one?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to share my screen. Just let me know if you can see my PowerPoint presentation. You can see it?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, everybody. As I introduced myself, so I'm not going to repeat introducing myself, but now my session is mainly focused at women, highlighting their role as invisible agents to the urban economy. And this has been motivated actually, maybe I can just put it the slideshow. Just a second. I don't know how to put it. I need to, yes. So what I have motivated this presentation is that motivated by the slogan of the SDGs, minding the gap and leaving no one behind. And when I'm looking at minding the gap, I'm looking at the gender gap in the SDGs by making low-income women visible in the urban setting and leaving no one behind by identifying low-income women in the urban setting as the most marginalized group among the marginalized group with respect, especially with respect to affordable housing. So what these slides or this presentation want to highlight is to acknowledge the crucial role the low-income women contribute to the urban economies and the substantial role also they do to sustainable development that usually go unnoticed. And this does not only intensify low-income women marginalization in the city, but also have the potential to compromise on the genuine efforts that have been paid for sustainable urban development and sustainable urban economy. So what I'm trying to advocate here is to adopt a system thinking to SDGs and where the whole affect the part and the part also impacts the whole, and also to apply a gender integrated approach when we are looking to urban economy, sustainable and affordable housing, towards more satisfaction to the SDGs and by extension, the new urban agenda. So applying the main theme of the fourth theme, which is having like innovative way of solutions for housing and sustainable development, innovation usually is commonly refers to a new product, method, process, or model. But here I want to shake the thinking a little bit and say innovative in the way we perceive things or look at things. So I would like to invite you to look innovatively and think about the urban cities as, and looking at urban populace as not a homogeneous group, but a gendered beings. So have their own diverse or different gender entities. And then looking at urban spaces and urban buildings as gendered spaces. What do I mean by gendered urban populace? So referring to gendered urban populace, like identify their heterogeneities and differential gender needs, aspiration, perspectives, and wants in the city, and how they have lived the lived experience with the city. With, of course, acknowledge intersectionalities based on biological sex, class, race, ethnicity, and age, etc. And then looking at urban spaces in terms of public spaces or transport lines, or even looking at the buildings and the designs of building, and including housing and other institutional building or any other type of buildings as gendered spatial context where gender power relationship is enacted, produced, and perpetuated. So with that way of perceiving or applying a gender lens to the city, we come and look at who are the low-income women, and we are looking at the productive age between 18 to 65 or 60 when you consider a woman as an adult, and up to 65. So the urban low-income women, which I would like to advocate for putting them at the center of the attention, came to the city either during to the rural-urban migration, influenced by the rural push from escaping maybe poverty or seeking maybe on the pull of the urban centers, which provide better services, better potentials for better living. And I would like also to shake the thinking again and look immigration as also a kind of urbanization, because now the cities of the North America or the of the global north are also impacted by the huge number of urbanization, and nothing can represent that as the Canadian cities, especially now with the immigration from all of the world, the cities of the global south coming to impact or live in the urban cities. So we cannot avoid looking at those intersectionality and those diversity in terms of ethnicities, class, and also sociocultural backgrounds. So I would like to look at adopt here a gender analytical framework that have been developed by Caroline Moser, a prominent researcher in gender planning, Global South and North. And she developed a framework of a model where she looks at everything to analyze she put women at the center and look at, identify, or look at the difference between men and women based on gender role or gender labor roles. So she identified that, and also gender needs. So women triple roles in housing specifically, but also generally, she identified women that are always multitasking or concurrently attending to their reproductive role of caring for the family and nourishing the family members and family care, and also productive, which they like to contribute to the economic stability of the family or herself individual, whatever kind of family structure she is part of. And then women are found to be usually committed or involved in community management, which give her some kind of social cohesion and some kind of feeling of belonging. And then she identified women needs as basically practical needs that get to do with the convenience of her everyday life and how to perform their everyday life activities, and the strategic needs that transform the imbalances in societies between men and women, like advocacy, long-time advocacy of capacity building, and also their contribution in the public and political and decision-making sphere. So using this strategy goal and looking at the issue of housing or affordable housing. So the first thing that when women come to the city, putting the affordable housing with the SDG number 11 at the center of the attention, we find that to make cities and human settlements more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, that means that we have to embrace people with marginalities. And the first thing that the first challenge they need is like having a housing, right? So when they come, especially in the cities of the north, global north, we find that they are based by that they have to have, it's very expensive, so it's not affordable. Then again, issues like credit score for you to be able to be eligible, or employment letter, or all those kind of things, which low-income women, whether they're coming from rural areas of the Canadian context or coming from the global south as immigrants, they usually lack those kind of things. So it makes their accessibility to the formal market, housing market, is not accessible. So they go to the invisible, like renting part of a house or a basement apartment, which now they become like at the mercy of the landlords. And now they pay those kind the rent in cash, because this is hidden. So this is now develop another kind of housing market outside the formal market, which in fact contributing or impacting the economic, the urban economy, but it is not actually showing in the data and statistics. And this is also create the problem of housing, financialization of housing, which is a challenge now. SMCC and all economic institutions and people are concerned with affordable housing are conversing and trying to find solution for. And then also we come like the slogan of providing how adequate whatever they can afford to have, because they need to live closer to the city so that they can have the employment opportunities or services, schools for their kids, or health facilities. So they squeeze themselves on those kind of houses, and they, in a way, like beggars cannot be choosers, because that is what is available for them. So they have to put up with those sometimes below substantial needs. So this is creating gendered spaces, and we know that gendered space are the space according to the design, whether they have been designed by somebody to accommodate these people. So the social perspective of the designer are also having impact, whether it's a man or a woman, and we know that housing is and related professional fields are male dominated. If we talk about design, like environmental design with its geography or its architecture, landscape, whatever, dominated by men, and engineering, of course. And then also creating gender space by who is using the space, according based on the gender, and what shows that it's convenient for one another is also very gendered. And then the other challenge they meet with is employment, and this is also the economic part of it. So this is relevant to SDG 1, which ending poverty but now women need to go and mobilize, as you talk now, to reach those services and employment opportunities. But is the urban space, does public space, are they safe for low-income women? And then at the same time, what kind of employment they can get used to? When some of them that people are coming as immigrant, they have a language barrier. Sometimes their skills and their knowledge is not accredited or acknowledged in Canada. And even low-income women, some of them, they are not even have the level of education that can make them land in a good employment opportunity. So this is marginalize them again and put them resolve to other kind of activities, which is home-based enterprise or income-generating activities that is from home. So the home now represents, other than a place to live, is also a place to work. And what more than the COVID-19 that shows us across in our intersectionality that home is far beyond a place to live, but also a place to work. So these two, when you look at them, you find that they are directly connected to SDG number 5, which is gender equity, equality, empowerment, and inclusivity. So now this is what more than this can show that we need to have like a system thinking, because if you touch any one of the SDGs, it touches or having impact on the other one. And then it's only through that system thinking we can uplift and we can move with SDG forward as a whole, but also as we are working in each one as an individual SDG. So not as a separate silos that does not impact the other. So going from there, what can we get from there? So the resolution that I would like to send across for it to be incorporated in the final resolution that we would like to come with at the end of this forum is adopt system thinking and gender integrated approach to support urban autonomy and also sustainable development. So this system thinking and gender integrated approach should recognize urban populace as gender heterogeneities and intersectionality, as we say that they are different in class, ethnicity, age, and also inclusivity in terms of also people who are having some disabilities or with special needs to be included, to promote kind of intentional policies. So we need to put those extra vulnerable groups at the center so that not to be left, to make sure that they are not left behind. So we have intentional policies, strategies, and programs. Secondly, we can admit, and this approach should also admit and support low-income women contribution to urban economy by the rent they're paying, by the economic activities they are doing at their own home, or getting involved in cash jobs that are not clear or not visible for the economic system and financial system in Canada, which also impact also what is happening. And devise kind of innovative financial models that facilitate low-income women access to formal affordable housing and also to overcome the challenge of financialization of housing. And then recognize that resolution also, or that approach should recognize urban space, the urban buildings and housing as gendered spaces. So in this case, if they are gender space, then we should raise awareness of urban designers to those issues, so that when they are crafting, maybe you talked about land use plan, you talked about when we are designing infrastructure, roads and whatever. So we have to look at people are not homogeneous group, but individuals with their own gender issues and their own aspirations and needs and perspective, to have a kind of inclusive approach, a participatory approach when they are designing those buildings, and have that kind of sensitivity. To support women triple roles, as we mentioned, the 3 roles that Caroline Moser identified: productive, reproductive, and community engagement roles, and also the practical needs that get to do with everyday life and that survival kind of mode. And this is so much linked to the community-based or grassroots level to in a way advocating for bottom-up approach. So those have to promote innovative, flexible environmental designs. When I say flexible environmental design, this is so much relevant to the housing needs that are changing, that are not static. A woman can be today as a young woman, as she old and the family structure changes, and then she might be a widow tomorrow, or divorced, or even single, so that the housing have to adapt to all women in different scenarios and situations. So there is kind of flexible, I would like to promote flexible housing, which is those housing can adjust to the different stages of life and different housing needs, and develop innovative, affordable, and readily available building materials. So even when we are designing, we have to bear in mind that there is modular housing and there is also kind of standardization. This needs collaboration between also OBC, the Ontario Building Code, to allow for those kind of building, also the material producers and the building material and technology development, so that it can support those kind of flexibility to embrace all what we have talked about. And only by adopting this, so not only, but this adopting those resolutions can contribute to achieve our common goal of sustainable urban economy and development towards the provision of safe, inclusive, and resilient cities. With this, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lydia. Lydia is a director for the Institute of Global Homelessness. Lydia, if you have slides, you can do a share screen. If I can ask Iman, if you can stop sharing screen. Thank you.
Great. So we'll be going in a different but related direction for my presentation. Just let me get my slideshow into presentation mode. So just a really quick overview of the Institute of Global Homelessness. We use the tagline, see it, solve it, share it, to describe what we do. And our first category there of see it has to do with our advocacy for international homelessness policy that's focused on the definition of homelessness, as well as measurement and data collection on homelessness. Right now, homelessness is not included in the Sustainable Development Goals or any of the 169 indicators. So when we think about, leaving no one behind, there's a very vulnerable group of our neighbors that will be left behind unless there are particular local, national, and international strategies designed to help support people through the experience of homelessness. Our second category of work, we have formal partnerships with communities all around the world who have all set particular goals and targets, both quantitative and qualitative, to progress towards ending homelessness in their communities. And then finally, we conduct a variety of knowledge sharing activities, from the International Journal on Homelessness, which is a peer-reviewed academic journal that looks at homelessness through a global lens, to conferences and summits and convening. So it's great to be here with you all today, sharing a little bit about IGH. So when we think about how to define homelessness globally, we recognize that there is a lot of nuance to how homelessness manifests in particular contexts. So one of the first pieces of work that IGH did when we were founded back in 2014 was to work with international researchers and practitioners to come up with a flexible framework for defining homelessness. So you'll see at the top, the green band just describes the 3 highest levels of homelessness. So people without accommodation, who are literally homeless, people who are living in temporary or crisis accommodation, so they have some place to stay, but it wasn't intended to be permanent. And then finally, people who are living in severely inadequate and insecure accommodation. So in that first bucket, people without accommodation, we think of people who are literally homeless. They might be living on the street, they might be living underneath highway overpasses, they may have put up a tent or some form of cover, but they're living in places that were not intended for humans to live in. In that second category, this is where we think about homeless shelters or hostels, domestic violence shelters, internally displaced persons camps or refugee camps. Again, people have somewhere to stay, but it was not intended to be permanent. And then the third category is sometimes called hidden homelessness. So people might be living doubled up. They might be living in overcrowded situations. There might be many families living in one shelter, in overcrowded conditions, those types of things. They might be living under threat of violence or could be evicted at a moment's notice. So this is where the majority of people experiencing homelessness would fall, and it's often not recognized as a form of homelessness. People can be moving through these different forms of homelessness really at any time. And so that's why we take this very broad and inclusive definition of homelessness, because unless we're thinking about all of these categories, we're not going to be able to end or even significantly reduce homelessness. And so there have been 2 recent United Nations resolutions that have used this description of homelessness. There was one passed by the Economic and Social Council in 2020, and then one passed by the General Assembly in 2021. So we're beginning to see this framework used as a very common description of what homelessness is. And people ask me sometimes, why is definition important? And the definition of homelessness really answers what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And so definition, again, becomes important when we think about measurement and data collection. That helps answer the question, what is the scope of the problem? So we need to have some international agreement on what is the problem and what is the scope of the problem. And it's really that measurement and that data collection that can inform decisions, can inform urban planning, can inform cities in terms of what the mix of housing and services is that they need to make sure that they're providing to the people who live in those cities and communities. So just very quickly, I won't go into all of them. I have listed out some very common methodologies for data collection on homelessness. They include something called point-in-time counts, registry or connections weeks, administrative data from healthcare systems, from carceral systems, from education systems, a method called capture recapture, and then census data. Most of these methodologies are lagging indicators, but they can still be used to help inform resourcing decisions around housing and services. All of these methodologies have their own pros and cons. They all take their own kinds of resources and capacity in order to deliver. And so it's really important that each community reflect on what their capacity is to collect data on homelessness, and think about how they can establish a baseline and improve that data collection over time. And again, we know definition and data do not solve homelessness. It's really the interventions that solve data can provide the trends and the insights necessary for communities to make resource decisions, resource allocation decisions, and particular interventions on homelessness that they want to see in their communities. So again, just kind of a quick list of housing options. Communities should strive to provide a certain amount of all of these types of housing in their community. So we think about emergency shelter, we think about transitional or short-term housing, permanent supportive housing for people who are always going to need a place to live and services along with that place to live, housing vouchers, social or public housing, affordable housing, and market rate housing. So it's really thinking through the mix of housing options that are available in a community and using the data to tailor that mix. So you need to collect the data as well as demographic information on the types of people who are experiencing homelessness in order to get the mix correct. All of the housing options should be paired with comprehensive services. I think Yvonne said at the beginning, what was the phrase around sort of the social infrastructure. So you need to pair the housing, the hard infrastructure, with that softer social infrastructure, making sure that people have access to employment services, like Dr. Ayman was sharing about, language services, if people are migrants or refugees and need some help acquiring the language of their new community. Physical health care, mental health care, family reunification and mediation services, just general case management services, education for people to improve their or increase their education level. So really a comprehensive mix of services. And then case managers can know, based on the profiles of their clients and their individual stories, what is the housing and what is the service mix that will best support that person through their experience of homelessness. And again, the data is going to inform communities how much of each housing type and each type of service is needed in your community. So it's essentially a formula. You need to know how many women are experiencing homelessness in your community. How many of those women have children? What are the particular drivers into homelessness for women? It's domestic violence in a lot of situations. And so they're going to need some particular trauma-informed care to help integrate that experience and set them up for success as they move through that experience of homelessness. So understanding those common subpopulations of people experiencing homelessness. Youth homelessness between the ages of sort of 16 and 24 is becoming a greater and greater phenomenon. Foster care and aging out of foster care is a huge driver of youth homelessness. So again, understanding what those young people's experience have been and tailoring housing and services to them. Young people are going to need a higher level of sort of education and employment services in order to become sustainably housed in the future and keep them from returning to homelessness. So again, collecting that data, understanding the profiles of people experiencing homelessness in communities, drawing out the trends will give you and will give communities and planners an understanding of how much emergency shelter they need, what types of services need to accompany that emergency shelter, how much permanent supportive housing is needed, how many housing vouchers are needed, how many more units of public or social housing are needed. And then again, you need to be regularly collecting that data, reviewing that data, including the rate of return to homelessness. So for what percentage of people was that housing and services mix not accurate? And then from that data, you can adjust that mix. It's really a continuous cycle. We work with communities all the time on their mix of housing and services. And what we always say to them is a continuous learning mindset is necessary. The mix that you need on October 4th, 2022 is not going to be the same mix you're going to need on October 15, 2025. You have to continue collecting and reviewing that data and adjusting over time. So I'll stop there. Very happy to take questions when we get to that point or dialogue. But again, I think when we think about how to allocate resources for homelessness and for housing, starting with the definitions and the data collection is key. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lydia. So our last speaker is Matthew. Matthew is, congratulations, Matthew. This is the new Commissioner of Transportation Services with Region of Waterloo. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Iman. Can you hear me? So I'll bring it back and more to my experience working in France before moving to Canada 6 years ago on what some practical challenges around the specific issues around walkability. So I know and having seen the development world and how we work in Canada to work on urban regeneration, one of the challenges is walkability is not going to generate a lot of direct revenue. So you're not going to find direct revenue models that will help to fund and incentivize walkability in a deep and sustainable way in cities. So I would say once you start from there, then the next stage is, well, at least from a public benefit standpoint, what we're, what are the different types of values that we want to create with, through walkability. And, one of them that's kind of that we classically look at is health benefits. We know that having more walkable neighborhoods has direct benefits to health. So it's lower costs on our health infrastructures, and people live longer and happier lives if they get to walk on a more regular basis. So we know that's a I would say it's an averted cost to the economy that we know we can gather as a benefit that's associated with walkability. Another typical value that we look for in walkability is making sure that public spaces are inclusive. We know that as soon as, and that's a little bit to the two presentations that came before, both on gender and on homelessness, we know that there are ways to make public spaces and urban environments exclusive. When you start reserving things for cars, you know that you're starting to narrow down that space for some specific users. You know that it's going to be more male, more affluent. I mean, that's what the space is going to end up for. So we know there are ways to kind of include, or on the other side of the scale, exclude. So that value of inclusion is also, and really making sure that the city is open for all is an important value. That's an important benefit of walkability. Another more commercial one would be footfall. So that's something that you can start measuring, and where you can start seeing where you can build some economic models that could, where the incentives could be aligned with walkability. We know that if you design the spaces to kind of structure the footfall to follow specific itineraries and things like that, that can actually create some commercial value in the buildings that are nearby. And these are things where you can start to kind of partner and work across different partners and economic partners on how to develop the walkability of an existing or a future site. I think in my practice in France, one of the challenges that we've seen, so I was working in the city of Lille in northern France for a decade before moving to Canada. And I think the challenge we saw there was really about how can we work with with the developers and our developer partners to create that public space. And we had a number of challenges, and a lot of them are actually related to skills. I think even when we partnered with developers who had a very positive outlook and wanted to do something, even them, when you talk to them, they said they kind of admitted that they don't really have the skills to deal with public space. They don't know how to build them. They don't have that expertise. That's not their core of business, and they have to focus on what they know what to do, and that's a part that was very challenging for them. So even when we had, I remember in some urban regeneration projects where we had some very kind of leading developers who wanted to kind of show and model the way, it was difficult for them to actually implement good quality, durable, walkable spaces, because they just didn't have that skill set or that capability in-house. So then it was, I would say in the French model, there are really different ways that we can help to fill these gaps. So both kind of making sure that we find ways for the city to capture some of the value, and two, we find ways to fill some of the skills gaps that we can have when public authorities are working with private developers or any investors in urban spaces. The first way that is fairly classic, but it has to be really, I think, we have to pay a lot of attention to, is design standards and guidelines. I think that's, they're often kind of put somewhere in the technical part of a website. So it's they're considered maybe just like technical specifications for public spaces, but they're actually very fundamental as documents that can demonstrate or shared expectations for what public spaces have to be. And that means also, that's something I remember specifically ranting against that when I was working in Lille, is also you have to think about the public spaces in the worst possible conditions. I really did not, we often had developer renderings where you had the perfect day. So kind of like today, beautiful day, nice sunny skies, no issues, no specific issues to deal with. But and that really does not reflect people's daily experience and what they and it actually, it makes for a very, going back to the theme of inclusion that you discussed earlier, it actually is not preparing for inclusive spaces, because people have different perceptions of spaces. We know that on relative to gender differences, women and men are going to perceive the safety of public spaces in very different ways. So if you always think of the best case scenario, you're actually excluding a number of users from being comfortable in that space in the future. So that means, in the design guidelines themselves, they have to incorporate that. They have to look at, and I remember some of the more successful projects that we were able to drive, and Lee looked at a lot of very small details, but like, pedestrian level lighting in low light or in bad weather conditions. So, these things might look like, if you consider them too much as like a technical specification, they'll be brushed aside and then nobody will actually take care of them. But they're actually fundamental to make sure that the use of the space is going to be good in the future. Now, also with climate change, we know that there's the quality of these spaces is going to change in the future too, because we'll have bigger ranges of temperatures. We'll have the role of urban canopies will be much greater in the future. These are things that have to be addressed directly in these design guidelines today, because if we don't create a common understanding now, then, well, again, these might end up kind of being sidelined and not really being discussed in the future. Same thing with conflicting uses. I think the inclusion is also about acknowledging that there can be conflicts in public space, and it's because we know whether it's through events or between deliveries and walkability, that we know that, I mean, the city is full of micro conflicts. So I think acknowledging that also in the design standards is important, so that we don't paint just a picture that's a little bit too rosy or too uniform of how we want to use the public space. So that's kind of the first way of dealing with it. And the second way, which is a bit of an illustration of, I would say, a historical model that has been prevalent in France on a lot of urban regeneration programs, is that model of having kind of private public development organizations that are really tasked with the regeneration of certain areas of cities. So that's a widespread model in France that's been proven, at least in the French ecosystem, but it is, some of it is transferable to other countries. So I would, invite to look at that. But it's really about creating conditions for good partnerships and building the skills to develop kind of newer transformed neighborhoods in the future. And that includes, and that means these public-private development organizations, they actually do the public preparation of the neighborhood. So they will deliver on the public spaces before or concurrently, while the developers or the landowners invest or renovate or do some more cosmetic upgrades to the existing housing stock that might be in there. But that's a model that's worked very well, where we've seen that it really helped to close the skills gap with developers, even when they wanted to. So I think these public development corporations, their core competency has become really urban space design, and then they've incorporated, I would say, the full complexity of the types of specifications and standards that I was mentioning a little bit earlier. So that's an interesting model. I think here in Canada, I haven't seen a lot of comparable ones. I think maybe the closest example I've seen here is the Waterfront Toronto example, but really focused on, I would say, what in Lille, I remember we called kind of a developer's cookie, kind of a very high value and very, I would say, very marketable spaces. But that's a model that normally can be extended to a much broader range of spaces. I know again, in France, I had examples where this has been really developed. And for example, there's the whole Paris subway, the big subway network that's being developed right now, not in Paris proper, but in all of the suburban and the kind of the poorer suburban neighborhoods of Paris. And that public developer model is being applied to that entire transit corridor. So there's a public-private development corporation that is really in charge of doing all of the preparation of the lands to prepare for intensification along the entire subway corridors. So these are examples kind of application with, I think, are really can really help to kind of plan, organize, and implement walkability in key urban neighborhoods where there's a lot of investment happening at the same time. So maybe I'll stop there, and again, we'll to keep some time for questions. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Matthew. I think we have an excellent conversation. We touched on 3 buckets, primarily identifying the need is based on geographical, gender, and also the moving data as well. So that's interesting. So that means need to keep track of the on-the-ground condition in a continuing basis. Secondly, is on quality. I really like the analogy of exclusive versus inclusive, and providing a very tangible expectation and identifying the skills gap. I think this is a culture difference between North America and Europe, where in our culture in here, very often the private sector, they step in and they provide higher technical skill sets. So in order to deliver this walkable neighborhood where primarily the interest is on public land or area that will be used by public, it means need to build capacity within the public sector to take the lead on that. And lastly is on a public-private model. So on that, one follow-up question. Matthew, can you elaborate a little bit more in terms of financing and funding? And also maybe how it relates to different scale as well in respect to the timing of decision.
Yeah, just quickly on the financing, these so European rules have made this French model a little bit harder because they don't like these mixed kind of private public. So now a lot of these development corporations that used to be private and public, now most of them have actually they were forced because of EU rules to become completely public. But the initial model was actually we had the funders, so who put the upfront capital and these development corporations that bought the land for future regeneration. It was a mix of almost like a 50-50 mix of banks and public authorities. So and they were all betting on the fact that the value of that land, once you prepare it properly, once you make it attractive, intense, will have a lot of value for in growing urban areas. But these again, from a financing standpoint, these were there were some capital investments that were at the same 50-50 between the public sector, and usually it's more regional banks that have some kind of stakes in the community and that are also looking to develop employment lands in cities. So they were there kind of for that specific interest, and knowing that they believe that there was a financial interest in terms of limited return on capital. This is not they're not trying to get maximum returns there, but they're trying to get decent returns on capital on an operation where they could also be seen as as backing the community. So it's between kind of pure capitalism and philanthropy, somewhere in between. That's where they were asked to contribute and to fund. Then the rest, so that's for the capital of the development corporation. But then the whole objective of the development corporation is to buy land, prepare it, sell to developers, and then get rid of it and kind of cycle. And so the objective is to try like any also private developer to cycle through as much land as possible, because you don't want to hold on to land for too long. So that's a, we know that that's what drives your financial bottom line in the end. So that's kind of the model that had been developed. And I must say, in terms of, filling the skills gap, that's the model that's been operating in France for, I don't know, 3 decades. It takes time to build institutions. So it's not something you can do. It's not something you can do overnight, and it's something you have to do continuously. Because if you stop, if you kind of say, oh no, I'm going to get rid of this model now, I'll kind of close doors, and then we'll see again in 5 years if we can reboot it. That's not how it works, because you've built, it takes time to build these skill sets, and then you get the reputation, the capability of doing it, and then you're and that you can't do stop and go on things like that. But in most investments are the same. I think right now we're, and having worked for Metrolinx for a few years, I think we're seeing also how it's difficult, and it's take time to rebuild a public transit building capability at the scale of Toronto after having really decreased investments in previous decades. So that's so it takes time to build these institutions. But then I think we're, so I would say a recommendation is more as starting small to build the capability, get the reputation, demonstrate the added value that you bring, and then you can continue to expand in the ecosystem and show your value between the municipalities and the private developers.
Yeah, these are excellent insights. To Iman, I have a follow-up question. So with respect to human capital, you have mentioned from a gender perspective, usually they play multiple roles. Can you elaborate a little bit from the overall value proposition, resource, how you can think about how that would relate to improving the informal economy resources for walkable neighborhood?
So when we talk about, I don't know how it's going to improve the walkable things, but I think having unwalkable or feeling unsafe, or you can't even afford the transport cost, kind of make women, and especially this is more common in the global south, to resolve to home-based enterprise, which this home-based enterprise facilitate women attending to the 3 roles concurrently, which is in most socio-cultural contexts, this is what women are mandated with. So in this case, when you are talking about there's some kind of financial system that is subtle, that is not visible for economic institutions, that's why I was thinking like, maybe it's time now to shed a light on those kind of invisible kind of market or something under or outside the formal economic structure, so that you can tap those kind of, because if you facilitate public utilities or affordable kind of communication, transportation for low-income women to reach those services and to be able to benefit from these things, and then maybe they will be encouraged to contribute part of this financial things to, to make it formalized and in the formal system where you can tap maybe fees or any kind of models or modalities that can make even using the public transport feasible to them. So, but now we have to look at all those things from sociocultural perspective. Like it's not only about reaching those services, the soft service you're talking about, or reaching the hospitals or having public they have to, as now the mayor is talking about, like using walkable distance, there is no revenues. So when you look at things in terms of like, why should I have the interest of having kind of safe walkable spaces? Because you don't have to look at the thing in financial things, but in social capital and human resource and creating the safe environment, then in a way, you avoid a lot of social ills like violence against women in public spaces or attacks for women when they're going. So this is what I would like to link. That is a holistic approach and system thinking, like when you look at things at the micro level and also at the macro level. If you are talking about community-based, then we have to embrace that these triple roles actually of having income generating activities. For example, if I get the immigrants who are coming here doesn't know the language. They don't have the skills and the education sometimes. Look at the Syrian refugees. I have been sitting in a single parenting kind of organization to help them. What they do is like they use what they need to substantiate their income, because what they receive from the welfare is not satisfying their needs. So what they do, they cook at home, they knit at home, they sell it to whoever they know, and then they get some cash, or they are involved in cleaning services and whatever, when they get cash money. But how to reach also those points is another issue. So I don't know whether I have answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Iman. I think you have make a very interesting correlation with respect to Matthew when he was talking about walkability. It's not just measuring the distance. This is making an argument saying the quality in terms of safety is actually impacting productivity. So that is contradicting to recreating the local economy. So last follow-up question for Lydia. So in Helsinki, they have made initiative to eliminate homelessness permanently, particularly in the city core. How do you see that relating to walkable neighborhood? And from a practical standpoint, what are some of the financial measures that need to be in place?
Yeah, so Finland made a decision in 1987, which was UN Habitat's International Year of Shelter, that they were going to eliminate homelessness. So they've been looking at this for 40 years, just about. So I was thinking about what Matthew said in terms of like, what's the sustainability of these practices? Are we continuing to look at these practices over years, decades? How do we resource governments and communities to be able to do that? They also, when you think about the definition that I shared, they first started with literal homelessness. When they eliminated literal homelessness, they looked at shelter homelessness. So now in Helsinki, they have about 50 emergency beds. They know from the data exactly how many emergency beds that they need, and they stay ahead of that need by projecting how many units they need to buy off of the free market every year and set up as affordable housing. And now they're really looking at that third category. So when they say they're going to eliminate homelessness, they're thinking about people who are living inadequate and insecurely housed. So it's a really good example for how you can start with sort of one definition of homelessness and then expand out there using the data, accessing the hard and the soft infrastructure. And then in terms of sort of walkability and safety, all of these issues are connected. Homelessness and housing are often thought of in really separate buckets. It's not considered a part of a community's walkability or safety. And so we have urban planners and people working in transportation who aren't accessing sort of the knowledge in the homelessness sector for how to pull all of these pieces together. And I think, when it comes down to financing, homelessness is a cost to communities. It's expensive to run shelters. It's expensive to provide those crisis and emergency services. And so there will be a cost benefit to communities to sort of addressing that crisis and emergency and beginning to work backwards into shelter, into prevention. And none of us want homelessness in our communities, right? We want to be living in cities and communities where there isn't any homelessness. And so I think the more we can bring these threads together, the housing thread, the urban planning thread, the transportation thread, the better off communities will be to respond to a variety of social issues, because it's all connected. We heard the word intersectional before. All of these issues are connected. So
great. Yeah, we're now at time. I think we have really made some interesting new connection, particularly redefining walkability with the social lens. So thank you very much for your contribution. And UEF will be putting together a resolution and we'll share the material with everybody when it is available. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.